Without these inventions, people would not have been able to survive in the Wild West. The American frontier is often portrayed as a world of brave cowboys and desperate gunslingers. But behind this romantic image lies another, much harsher reality. It was a daily struggle for survival, where the main enemy was not bandits, but nature itself. Relentless heat, freezing blizzards, and vast empty spaces. In these conditions, ordinary people, farmers, settlers, workers, became ingenious inventors. They had no access to stores, tools, or modern technology. Their only resource was their wits, which forced them to see treasure in trash and opportunity in problems. These forgotten life hacks of the Wild West are not just historical curiosities. They are a veritable encyclopedia of survival, written with the sweat and toil of people who turned a hostile desert into their home. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how ordinary dirt and grass could become more reliable than a stone fortress. I will reveal the best-kept secret of the prairie builders. When the first settlers arrived on the Great Plains, they were met with an unpleasant surprise. There were almost no trees here. There was nothing to build the familiar log houses from, and stone was too expensive. The solution was literally right under their feet. That solution was the earth itself, covered with thick grass and tightly intertwined roots. It was this top layer of soil, called sod, that became the main building material of the era. The idea was simple but ingenious. The settlers cut the sod into large flat bricks using a special plow. These bricks were surprisingly strong thanks to the dense root system, which acted as natural reinforcement, binding the soil together. Walls made of sod blocks were laid in 2 rows, with the grassy side down, so that the roots would continue to grow and further strengthen the structure. The gaps between the blocks were filled with ordinary mud. Such a house was, in essence, a living organism that only became stronger over time. The interior walls were often coated with clay or covered with newspapers to create a more comfortable environment. Despite its simplicity, such a house called a soddy was incredibly effective. The thick earthen walls served as an ideal insulator. In summer, the sod house was cool even in the hottest weather. In winter, it retained the heat from a small stove very well. This was vital in the harsh climate of the plains with its sharp temperature fluctuations. Moreover, the earthen house was practically fireproof. This gave its inhabitants a huge advantage during steppe fires, one of the most terrible disasters of the frontier. While wooden buildings burned like matches, the soddy remained intact. Such houses were not a temporary solution, but a full-fledged dwelling in which people lived for decades. They proved that expensive materials are not always necessary to build a reliable shelter. Sometimes it is enough to simply look at your feet. Of course, such houses had their drawbacks, such as leaky roofs and uninvited guests in the form of insects. But in conditions where a roof over one's head was a matter of life and death, sod houses were a real salvation. They became a symbol of the settlers' tenacity and ability to adapt to any conditions. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think about this approach to construction compared to modern eco-house technologies? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what kept settlers warm on cold nights? On the endless plains where there was no firewood, settlers faced an acute fuel shortage. The solution they found may seem shocking today, but at the time it was a matter of survival. That solution was dried bison dung, which the pioneers called bison chips, or prairie fuel. Huge herds of these animals left behind tons of this valuable resource. Women and children collected it in bags and baskets during long journeys. The sun-dried dung was completely dry and almost odorless. It consisted mainly of digested grass and fibers. It burned slowly and evenly, giving off a lot of heat, almost like peat or coal. This fuel was versatile. It was used to cook food, boil water, and heat temporary dwellings. Without bison chips, surviving the harsh winter on the Great Plains would have been nearly impossible. Gathering this resource was an important part of the daily routine. It was collected, dried, and stored for the winter, just like firewood. Having a large supply of chips meant that a family could survive the cold. This example clearly demonstrates the level of ingenuity of the settlers. They learned to see value in what anywhere else would be considered mere trash. For them, there was no waste, only resources. As the bison disappeared, the settlers switched to livestock manure. The technology remained the same. This proves that the very idea of using organic waste as fuel was universal. The story of bison chips is not just a fun fact. It is a reminder that in the struggle for survival, there is no room for squeamishness. There is only practicality and necessity. Of course, cooking with this fuel required a certain skill. It was necessary to maintain a constant heat and make sure that ash did not get into the food. But the pioneers quickly mastered this science as well. Bison provided people not only with food and skins, but also with warmth. But what if I told you that even the waste from the main agricultural crop could replace rope, mattresses, and even paper? Something you've never seen before. Corn was the main crop for many settlers, the true queen of the fields. But the pioneers valued more than just its ears. After the harvest, a huge amount of leaves and husks remained, which, in skilled hands, were turned into dozens of useful things. Throwing away such a valuable resource was unthinkable waste. Dry corn leaves, or husks, were a strong and flexible material. People learned to weave a wide variety of household items from them. Long strips of husks were woven into strong ropes that were as good as hemp ones. They were used to repair harnesses, tie hay bales, and for hundreds of other household needs. Such rope was absolutely free and always at hand. Women wove hats, baskets, bags, and even slippers from husks. These items were lightweight, durable, and provided excellent protection from the sun. The ability to weave corn husks was highly valued. Perhaps the most important use of husks was in the manufacture of mattresses. A bag made of coarse fabric was tightly stuffed with dry leaves. The result was a springy, breathable, and hypoallergenic mattress that was much more comfortable than sleeping on the bare ground. Such mattresses had to be refilled periodically as the husks crumpled over time. But this was not a problem, as new filling was abundant after each harvest. It was a simple and ingenious solution to the problem of sleeping places. Corn husks were also used as insulation. They were stuffed into cracks in the walls of houses to protect against drafts. Dry leaves retained heat well and did not let the cold wind through. Even the smallest scraps that were unsuitable for weaving were put to good use. They were used as tinder to light fires. Dry husks ignited from a single spark. This culture of zero waste was not a fad, but a necessity. Every part of the plant, from the grain to the stem, found its use. This allowed the settlers to be as self-sufficient as possible and not depend on outside supplies. Thus, a simple weed from the garden became a source of rope, dishes, clothing, and bedding. This is a vivid example of how the frontier taught people to see opportunities in the most ordinary things. What if everything you've been taught about cleanliness is outdated? In frontier conditions, maintaining hygiene was not a matter of comfort, but a matter of survival. But soap was expensive and in short supply. So settlers learned to make it themselves from two simple ingredients: wood ash and animal fat. The process was laborious, but the result was worth it. First, they made lye from the ashes of deciduous trees, a caustic substance that is the basis of any soap. To do this, they poured the ashes into a barrel with a hole in the bottom and slowly poured water through it. The resulting liquid, lye, was collected in a container. Its strength was tested using an old-fashioned method. A chicken egg was placed in the liquid. If the egg floated, exposing an area the size of a coin, the lye was considered ready for use. The second component was animal fat, which was left over after cooking. It was thoroughly cleaned by melting it several times with water. The quality of the future soap directly depended on the purity of the fat. Then the most important stage began: cooking the soap. The fat and lye were mixed in a large cauldron and slowly heated over an open fire. The mixture had to be stirred constantly for several hours. Gradually, a chemical reaction of saponification took place. The liquid thickened and turned into a homogeneous mass. The readiness of the soap was checked by cooling a small amount. It had to become solid and not stick to the hands.
We have plenty for everyone.
The finished soap mass was poured into wooden boxes lined with damp cloth. There it cooled and solidified within a day or two. After that, the large piece of soap was cut into bars and left to mature for several weeks. This homemade soap was very hard and worked well for washing rough work clothes and cleaning. It did not have a pleasant smell and was quite harsh on the skin, but it performed its main function, cleansing, flawlessly. The ability to make soap was an essential skill for any housewife on the frontier. It allowed them to keep their homes clean and prevent the spread of disease. It was a small but important step towards civilization in the midst of the wilderness. Cleanliness was important, but even more important was having a supply of food. In the next chapter, you will learn how they preserve food without refrigerators. In a world without refrigerators, preserving meat was one of the main tasks. Trappers, Native Americans, and settlers used ancient but incredibly effective preservation methods. The two main ones were jerky and pemmican. Jerky, or dried meat, was the simplest way to preserve game. The meat of bison, deer, or other large animals was cut into thin, long strips. It was important to cut along the grain so that the meat would not fall apart. These strips of meat were lightly sprinkled with salt, if available, and hung out to dry in the sun and wind. In the dry, hot climate of the plains, the meat dried out in a few days. It lost up to 75% of its weight, turning into a light and nutritious product. Properly dried jerky could be stored for months without spoiling. It was the perfect food for long trips. Light, compact, and requiring no preparation. It was the main source of protein for anyone who was far from home. Pemmican was an even more perfect product. It was a real energy bomb invented by the Indians of the Great Plains. Its preparation was more complicated, but the result exceeded all expectations. To make pemmican, dried meat, jerky, was ground into powder. To do this, it was crushed between two stones. The result was a very concentrated and nutritious meat flour. Then this meat powder was mixed with melted animal fat in a ratio of about 1:1. The fat acted as a preservative and a source of calories. Dried berries, cranberries, or erga were often added to the mixture for flavor and vitamins. The resulting mass was tightly packed into rawhide bags and sealed. In this form, pemmican could be stored for years without losing its nutritional properties. A small piece of this product could sustain a person's strength for a whole day of hard travel. European fur traders quickly realized the advantages of pemmican. It became a standard food for all expeditions and trading caravans. Without pemmican, the exploration of the vast territories of North America would have been simply impossible. These two products, jerky and pemmican, were the ideal solution to the problem of nutrition on the frontier. They allowed surplus meat to be preserved after a successful hunt and ensured survival during periods when there was no prey. It was a simple but vital technology. The secret that changed the cattle industry forever. The development of the Great Plains gave rise to a conflict between two groups of people: cattle ranchers who needed open pastures and farmers who wanted to protect their crops. Traditional wooden or stone fences were not possible here due to a lack of materials. The solution was barbed wire. Invented in 1874, barbed wire was a real revolution. It was a cheap and easy-to-install fence that effectively kept livestock in place. It allowed farmers to quickly and reliably fence off their land. However, cattle breeders, accustomed to free-range herding, were hostile to the new invention. They called it devil's rope and believed that it was destroying the open spaces of the frontier. This marked the beginning of the so-called fence wars, when cowboys cut the wire at night and farmers defended it with weapons in their hands. Working with barbed wire was hard and dangerous work. Special tools were needed to stretch it. One such invention was the wire stretcher, a simple lever device that allowed one person to stretch the wire with the strength of several. Special staples were used to secure the wire to the posts. Thick leather gloves were required to work with the sharp spikes, protecting the hands from cuts. The entire fence installation process was thought out down to the smallest detail. Despite all the conflicts, barbed wire prevailed. It forever changed the face of the American West, dividing the open prairies into neat squares of private property. The era of free grazing and large cattle drives came to an end. Barbed wire affected not only agriculture, but also the entire social structure of the frontier. It strengthened the position of settled farmers and forced cattle breeders to switch to ranching. It was the end of the Wild West and the beginning of its settled agrarian history. The invention of barbed wire is a striking example of how one simple technology can radically change the economy, landscape, and even the way of life of an entire region. It was a quiet but very important revolution. Today, barbed wire is associated with prohibitions and restrictions. But back then, on the frontier, for thousands of farmers, it was a symbol of protection, order, and the future. It allowed them to defend their right to land and the fruits of their labor. The wire divided the plains, but in the Southwest, where there were no forests for posts and no need for huge corrals, people built their homes and shelters from the earth itself. More on this in the next chapter. In the arid Southwest, in the lands of the Apache and Navajo, the main building material was not wood or turf, but clay. For centuries, local tribes built their homes from adobe bricks, or adobe. This technology was ideally suited to the hot and dry climate. Adobe is essentially a sun-dried brick. To make it, clay, sand, water, and straw were mixed together. The straw acted as a reinforcing material, preventing the bricks from cracking as they dried. The mixture was thoroughly mixed, often simply with the feet, until a homogeneous mass was obtained. This mass was then placed in wooden molds and left for several hours. When the bricks had hardened slightly, they were removed from the molds and left to dry in the sun for several weeks. The process was completely manual and did not require complex equipment. All the materials were literally at their feet. This accessibility made adobe the main building material in the region for many hundreds of years. The walls made of adobe bricks were very thick. This provided excellent thermal insulation, which worked differently than in sod houses. During the day, the thick walls slowly absorbed the sun's heat, keeping the interior cool. At night, when the desert cooled down, the walls slowly released the heat accumulated during the day. This allowed a comfortable temperature to be maintained inside the dwelling around the clock. Adobe houses literally breathed in unison with the daily rhythms of the desert. Adobe buildings were durable, but required constant maintenance. Every year after the rainy season, the walls had to be covered with a new layer of clay plaster to protect them from erosion. It was a kind of ritual that brought the community together. Spanish colonists who came to the Southwest quickly adopted this technology. They built not only houses from adobe, but also large missions and forts. The adobe style in architecture became the hallmark of states such as New Mexico and Arizona. The adobe manufacturing technology is an example of the ideal harmony between humans and the environment. It did not require burning fuel to fire bricks or cutting down forests. It was an environmentally friendly and sustainable architecture that had been proven over centuries. Adobe construction was not just a technology, but part of the culture. It reflected the unhurried pace of life and the deep connection between people and the land that provided them with food and shelter. During the Great Depression and the constant shortage of money on the frontier, every item was used multiple times. Farming families learned to turn ordinary flour, sugar, or feed bags into clothing and household items. This phenomenon became so widespread that manufacturers began to encourage it. Initially, the sacks were made of coarse canvas with the company logo printed on them. Housewives soaked the sacks, washed off the ink, and sewed children's clothes, aprons, and underwear from the resulting fabric. It was a harsh necessity, not fashion. Manufacturers of flour and other goods quickly noticed this trend. They realized that they could increase customer loyalty by making the bags more attractive. It was a brilliant marketing move, born out of sympathy and commercial calculation. Companies began to package their products in colorful calico bags with bright patterns. Now, women did not have to wash off the logos. They could immediately use the beautiful fabric to sew dresses, shirts, and curtains. The bags were printed with floral designs, geometric patterns, and even images of cartoon characters. Some companies even printed patterns for dolls or children's clothing on the fabric. Buying a bag of flour became like buying a piece of fabric. For many families, this was the only opportunity to update their wardrobe. Women exchanged sacks to collect enough fabric with the same pattern to sew a dress. Magazines published tips on how to make the best use of this free material. Dresses made from sacks became a symbol of the era. They spoke of poverty, but also of dignity, pride, and incredible ingenuity. Even in the most difficult conditions, women managed to look neat and create comfort in their homes. This practice also taught thrift and frugality. Not a single scrap of fabric went to waste. The scraps were used to make patchwork quilts, rugs, and cleaning rags. The history of sackcloth clothing is not just a story of poverty. It is a story of human resilience and the ability to turn signs of hardship into symbols of hope and beauty. It was a fashion born not in Parisian salons, but on the dusty farms of the American frontier. Today, these dresses and patchwork quilts are collector's items. They remind us of a time when people knew how to find joy and beauty in the simplest things. Railroads were the arteries of the Wild West, but for thousands of unemployed drifters known as hobos, they also became home. These nomadic workers created an entire subculture with its own laws, signs, and unique inventions. Their engineering skills were focused on making travel in freight cars safer and more comfortable. The main task was to survive the long journey. The hobos learned to set up temporary dwellings right inside the cars. Using boards and tarpaulins, they created shelters from the wind and rain that could be quickly assembled and disassembled. For heating during the cold season, they used improvised stoves. These were made from old buckets or tin cans. Inside, they lit a small fire, using coal collected along the railroad tracks as fuel. Cooking also required ingenuity. The classic hobo dish was mulligan soup, which was prepared in a large tin can or pot. It contained everything they could get their hands on: vegetables from the fields, small game, and any donations from compassionate people. The hobo developed a complex system of signs that they left on fences, house walls, or railroad posts. These symbols informed other vagrants where to find food, work, or lodging. They also warned of dangers, such as an angry farmer or strict police. A special caste among the hobos were those who knew how to operate handcars or push them. They could borrow a handcar from track workers and ride it for dozens of kilometers, avoiding dangerous freight trains. This required tremendous physical strength and knowledge of railroad rules. To protect themselves from the railroad police, hobos devised ingenious hiding places. They built hiding places under train cars or in hard-to-reach places on locomotive tenders. The ability to become invisible was one of the main skills for survival. Despite the harsh conditions, hobo culture was imbued with a spirit of freedom and independence. They were masters of survival in the industrial world. Their life hacks were aimed at using the system to their advantage, while remaining outside of it. The hobo lifestyle is an extreme example of adaptation. They turned the hostile environment of the railways into their own ecosystem. Their inventions were simple but effective solutions to very specific problems. Today, hobo culture has virtually disappeared. But their story reminds us that human ingenuity knows no bounds and can thrive even in the most marginal conditions. In conditions where specialized tools were a luxury, settlers learned to make them from any scrap metal available. A broken cart, an old plow, or a part discarded on the railroad tracks could become a source of dozens of useful items. It was an era of total recycling and repair. Old files that had lost their sharpness were never thrown away. They were reforged into sturdy knives, chisels, or arrowheads. The high-carbon steel of the file held its edge well after proper hardening. Broken springs from carts were another valuable resource. Their elastic steel was ideal for making large knives, machetes, or even swords to defend against wild animals. A skilled blacksmith could turn a piece of rusty spring into a reliable weapon or tool. Rims from broken wagon wheels were also put to good use. They were cut and straightened to produce long strips of strong iron. These were used to make staples for construction, door hinges, or parts for repairing agricultural equipment. Railroad spikes, which lay in abundance along the tracks, were a versatile material. They were forged into hammers, axes, picks, and wedges for splitting wood. The strong steel of the spikes could withstand heavy loads. Even tin cans were not wasted. Tin was cut into patches for repairing roofs and used to make funnels, mugs, and lamps. Several cans could be used to make a simple but effective wood-burning stove. Wire, especially after its widespread distribution, became a universal repair kit. It was used to fix everything from harnesses to broken furniture. A few coils of wire were worth their weight in gold on the farm. This do-it-yourself or die approach was the basis of survival. People could not afford to simply throw away a broken item. They were forced to repair, rework, and give old items a new life. Such total ingenuity developed engineering thinking. Settlers learned to understand the properties of materials and find non-standard solutions. Every farmer was partly a blacksmith, carpenter, and mechanic. The legacy of this era is not only specific inventions, but also a way of thinking. It is the ability to see a problem as a challenge and any trash as a potential resource. It was this quality that allowed the pioneers to conquer the Wild West. We have looked at just a few examples of the amazing ingenuity that allowed people to survive and build a new life on the American frontier. Behind each of these life hacks, from grass houses to clothing made from sacks, lies not only ingenuity, but also incredible strength of spirit. These stories show that the human mind is capable of finding a way out of any situation, even the most hopeless. The experience of settlers, trappers, and itinerant workers is a harsh but important lesson. It reminds us of the importance of valuing resources, being flexible, and never giving up in the face of adversity. These skills, born in the crucible of the Wild West, remain relevant to this day. What other topics from the history of frontier exploration would you like to see on our channel? Perhaps you are interested in the life of mountain hunters, the tactics of Indian wars, or the construction of the first transcontinental railroads? Share your ideas in the comments and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.